Welcome to the Authority File. I'm Bill Mickey, your host and the editorial director at Choice. My guest for this series is Simon Dalby. Simon is a professor of geography and environmental studies at Wilfrid Laurier University in Waterloo, Ontario, where he teaches in the Balsillie School of International Affairs. He's also a senior fellow at the Center for International Governance Innovation. Simon's latest book is called Anthropocene Geopolitics, Globalization, Security, Sustainability. The title was published by the University of Ottawa Press in early 2020, but it was overshadowed by the subsequent pandemic, so we're very happy to finally get a chance to speak with Simon about it. Fair warning, we're talking about the environment, sustainability, and what governments around the world are doing about it or not. As you can guess, it's a daunting subject. Nevertheless, Simon's book lays out a compelling case for situating our thinking around forward-looking strategies that can guide us toward peaceful outcomes. This series is brought to you with support from the University of Ottawa Press. In this third episode of our series, Simon and I have a discussion about globalization from an environmental perspective, what environmental insecurity is, and why security concerns have not caught up with climate-related threats. Let's move on to globalization. I mean, I think we tend to think about that in commercial or trade concepts, but it's much more than that, obviously. Can you situate globalization on a broader perspective in terms of how it's impacting the Earth itself?
I tend to think of globalization in terms of linkages and connections. Most of the traditional thinking is we start with states, they have clear boundaries around them, and then we trade across them or we move across them or our cultural influence goes across boundaries. But it seems to me that when you're now thinking about the Anthropocene, we need to add in a bunch of other connections. It's not just sort of cultural and political things, but literally the materials that we are moving across borders, vast quantities of industrial fuels, coal and oil and gas, vast quantities of consumer commodities, the vehicles, the computers, the furniture, the construction products, the two by fours that build houses. Everything is now moving, and we need to think about those material connections quite as much as we do about the economics or the politics of going across borders. So that really is why I try to get people to think about globalization as a sort of a material process, but one which is actually transforming how we live, but also simultaneously translating or transforming how the Earth system works too. So they're sort of two sides of the same coin. We're simply looking at them from the social sciences or from the physical sciences. What I've been trying to do is get people to think about them in terms of the consequences of the material moves as much as the social and political connections. Money flows across borders all the time, but so do all these other materials. So do ideas about how to live too. The cultural dimension that goes with this isn't just music crossing borders in Spotify or on some Google sound system or whatever. But it's also very much about the lifestyles that go with that, the fashions and everything else. But depending on which fashion you go, which fabric is making your clothes has consequences for which crop gets grown the other side of the world, and then is it hemp or is it cotton? Those kinds of questions tie the social back into the ecological consequences, often in places we've never heard of the other side of the world. And we need to stop and think about globalization as that process of physical transformation as well, if we're to grapple with the consequences of this phenomena more comprehensively. And that's what I'm really trying to get at in terms of how I'm thinking about globalization. Because globalization is one of the terms in the subtitle of my book, quite deliberately to flag this.
Exactly. So in chapter 7, you bring up environmental insecurity. One of the results of that insecurity is the emergence of technological attempts to alter the course of our environmental impacts. Nuclear power is one example, but these examples themselves pose dangers to the environment. Fukushima is a recent result of that, and seem to center on efforts to forestall the inevitable. Are we, really at a point where we need to be geoengineering the delays disaster, or is that just one approach? Do we still have time to eliminate permanent environmental disaster.
Yeah, chapter seven is tricky because what I'm trying to get at there is that numerous technologies are potentially disastrous one way or another.
Hmm.
Nuclear power actually supposedly is advantageous in terms of climate change because if
Right.
you're not burning stuff to generate electricity, then you're not generating carbon dioxide, you're not causing global atmospheric change. Nuclear power is one of its advantages. So the argument goes is that it reduces the amount of carbon dioxide that we're generating, makes climate change a little slower than it otherwise would be. Well, that's fine until it goes wrong. Then
Right.
you have an environmental disaster with radiation all over the place. But you also, of course, had the Japanese were scrambling as they closed down their reactors after the other reactors after the disaster. And they were scrambling to find alternative ways of generating electricity, which meant that they started importing fossil fuels again, which sort of gets us back to the starting place. So one could argue that the Fukushima was a disaster twice over. Yes, there
Hmm.
was the meltdown of the reactors and the radiation that leaked, but it was also a disaster for climate because of all the extra carbon that got burned as a result.
Yeah.
So one of the things I'm just teasing out there is that sort of technology and environmental insecurity may be about choosing your disaster. The geoengineering stuff, of course, it depends on how you look at this. The potential for it to go wrong, have all sorts of unanticipated environmental consequences because we're tinkering with the atmosphere by putting large amounts of stuff in it in terms of so-called solar radiation management, literally putting aerosols into the upper atmosphere to cool the planet. Well, we might actually end up messing up with the monsoon. Might we, if we get the monsoon seriously messed up and crops fail in Asia, then we have major food crisis on our hands because geoengineering, by our attempt to cool the planet, has unanticipated ecological consequences. Maybe not, but that's what the debate is about. You pick your disaster. Do you have climate change, which is disastrous, or do you take your chances with geoengineering, which might cool it down, but that might be disastrous in different ways. And so you've got your choice between disasters. Do it, make be disastrous. Not doing it's probably going to be disastrous. And my argument in that chapter is that politics is about choosing which disaster you think is actually worse when it comes to questions of security relating to environment. Yes, it's a very pessimistic chapter because I'm tangling with these really big questions. The point that, of course, that is absolutely crucial to the book is precisely that we're living in an increasingly artificial environment. That's
Hmm.
the key point about the Anthropocene. We're making all sorts of new stuff. We are changing how the world works, and increasingly we are living in an artificial world, in which case, then the decisions we make about which technologies to deploy, how and where, have got all sorts of potential dangers. But that's just what happens when you live in an increasingly artificial world where the shape of the future of that world is being made by the technological choices that our societies make.
Right.
That's no longer something we can ignore, and it's part of living in the Anthropocene.
Right. I got the sense that in that chapter, that because we're sort of this artificiality that we're living with now, that we're tending to favor or default to the geoengineering choice. That's kind of just how the social thinking goes in terms of the choices that we end up making.
Certainly, I mean, there's increasingly arguments being made along these lines, precisely because we're not getting a handle on climate change. We're getting into
Yeah.
increasingly severe consequences, and something has to be done.
Mm.
Therefore, we better go and have a good hard look at this. I originally was highly skeptical about this until I dug into the literature and had a good hard look at it. And I actually changed my mind on this because I thought, maybe simply having this conversation about, well, should we be putting large quantities of chemicals into the upper atmosphere to shade the planet might actually get people's attention about, well, actually, this is a really bad idea. we'd better do something about climate change, because otherwise the people that are making this argument are going to end up actually doing it. And so we better head this off. And the only way to head this off is to get much more serious about ramping down our use of carbon fuels, so that these geoengineering types don't have an excuse to experiment with the only habitable planet that we know of.
Okay. I'm wondering if you could speak generally to some of the reasons why security issues have not caught up with climate-related threats. Is this mainly because of the sort of combative politics around climate change?
Well, yeah, but once you start digging into this whole climate security thing, it gets to be awfully complicated very quickly. Perhaps
Hmm.
the most basic point about this, and the thing that troubles me in work, not just in this book, but beyond it, in other things that I'm working on, is that usually, traditionally, particularly in North America, national security has been the kind of security we think about. It's about protecting us from external threats out there. Back in the Cold
Yeah.
War, it was the Soviet Union. After Osama bin Laden's attack on 9/11, it was Islamic terrorism. And now we're beginning in North America to worry about Chinese threats, although they're mostly economic rather than military. And the problem with climate and security and all the rest of it is that North Americans are particularly bad in terms of generating carbon dioxide. If there's a climate threat, well, actually, we're causing it. It's not an external threat to us. We are actually threatening lots of other people around the world by our profligate use of carbon fuels.
Right.
And hence the geography of this is all backwards, because we're used to external threats that we need to, keep the bad guys out. But in fact, in this case, we're the bad guys, because historically we've generated more carbon dioxide per person than most other societies. If there's a climate villain on the planet, it's North Americans.
Mm.
The Australians aren't doing very well either, but and there's a few people in the Middle East that are now burning enormous quantities of carbon fuel. But basically, we've seen the threat, and he is us. If you'll allow me to quote the Pogo, the cartoon strip from 50 years ago, and that's one of the reasons why it's tricky. It's also tricky insofar as the military institutions are huge fuel users. If you're going to fly jet planes around at ridiculous speeds, you burn a heck of a lot of fuel to do it. If you're going to have military bases all over the planet, and the ships and planes that connect up that transportation system to keep them functioning, huge users of fossil fuels. The military is also the institution that's supposed to be guarding us from threats, and yet they're one of the worst offenders in terms of generating precisely the source of the threat, that carbon dioxide. I mean,
Hmm.
ironically, the U.S. military in particular over the last few years has begun to have to grapple with the consequences quite directly. Norfolk Broad's the biggest naval base on the planet, just south of Washington, there on the Atlantic coast, is getting flooded from rising sea levels. Off a base in, where is it, North Dakota. I think one of the big strategic bomber bases was flooded a couple of years ago by extraordinary Midwest flooding events. So, in fact, the military is actually having to deal with the practical consequences of extreme events driven by climate change. And they're getting very antsy about this for good reason, because they are not only having their own facilities suffer, but they're also the agency that's called first for, to deal with disasters, floods and fires, military logistics and equipment, and providing disaster aid. The military often gets called on to do this. So there's all
Hmm.
sorts of twists and turns in this discussion. But the real big problem is we are the threat. We're not the saviors. We're the cause of the problem in North America, and that is one of the key points that has to be worked into this. And that's one of the reasons why it's been a tricky one to get a handle on. Although that said, the military seems to understand the dangers far better than many. And one of the things that was been puzzling, particularly in North American politics for the last decade or two, is that the military is jumping up and down and saying, look, this is a big problem. Climate change needs to be tackled. And yet, clearly, the politics in this is working such that fossil fuel industries are far more influential in shaping public policy than military warnings about the dangers of climate change actually are. And so, while one might expect that a sensible government would take the threat warnings coming from its intelligence services and its military seriously, clearly there's something more important. and that is the fossil fuel industry in North America. And that's another one of the big contradictions linking climate and security.
Right. So, speaking of sort of the U.S. being one of the major offenders, and in a previous conversation, you talked about how the impacts of climate change are spread unevenly within countries and around the world. How do the unequal effects of climate change influence political and economic power? And how will geography play a larger role in politics and the global economy in the years to come?
Boy, there's a question that we could spend the whole hour just trying
Okay.
to tease out the answers to
Well,
that
you
one.
you've got
Um,
about 120 seconds.
yeah, well, I mean, it's fascinating in terms of the fact that the planet is heating unequally. Some places low lying. I've already mentioned the military naval bases in Norfolk. If you're in Louisiana where the coastline is eroding quickly, you're very conscious of rising sea levels. If you happen to be in Bangladesh, where there are millions of people living basically at sea level, increasing storms and rising sea levels are going to cause Bangladesh huge problems. Yeah, if you're investing in Florida real estate, it's worth pointing out that one of the first places to disappear under the waves is going to be Florida because it's just above the waves at the moment. If you're living in one of those places, then geography and security and climate are all intimately involved in your everyday decisions.
Hmm.
In terms of the international effects of this, well, is it going to generate large quantities of climate migrants, people traveling internationally when their island countries are flooded out? Well, if you happen to be a resident of Tuvalu or the Marshall Islands, these are considerations because your state may not exist a couple of decades hence. And so, the politics of this is simply that some countries are quite literally going to disappear under the waves. And that has obviously dramatic effects in terms of international law. If they're only small countries, well, then maybe it's not a huge consequence for some of the rest of us. If you happen to have real estate in Florida or Louisiana, pay attention. If you happen to have real estate in the north shores of Alaska where the permafrost is melting and the coast is eroding, pay attention too. If you're some of the native communities in the north end of Canada where this is happening too, quite literally, your community is going to disappear under the waves because the land is no longer frozen; it's melting, and the ice is thawing, and those kinds of basic decisions about where are we going to live matter. Will this have international consequences? Well, it might have consequences in terms of migration. But the other side of this coin is the really interesting one that's just sort of bubbling under the policy world these days, and people are trying to think about it. If we get serious about climate change and rapidly reduce the amount of fossil fuels we use, oil, gas, and coal, then countries that have depended on the revenue from exporting those substances are suddenly going to find themselves with major budget crises. If Saudi Arabia suddenly can't export its oil because nobody's buying it, because everybody's moving on to new energy sources that don't require that oil, then they've suddenly got themselves a major economic problem. Is that going to have geopolitical consequences? Presumably, because some states are going to benefit, those that have got ahead of the game on windmills and new smart grid technologies and electric vehicles and so on, are presumably going to be economic winners, whereas those that are still driving gas vehicles and digging up oil and coal are presumably going to be losers, unless of course, they get smart and reorganize their economies to take advantage of what's coming in terms of the new investment opportunities. Failure to do that might lead to all sorts of difficulties. Every time there's a major fluctuation in oil prices, and that happens on a fairly regular basis, some countries suddenly have a boom, and other countries when have a major loss when they lose the revenue and the export figures just don't add up because oil is selling for $20 a barrel rather than 100. So we can get some indication about those kind of fluctuations. Will they become more severe in future as climate change policies reduce the use of petroleum? Well, it's entirely predictable. This is starting to happen. So now is the time, if you happen to be an oil producer, to figure out what you're going to do next. Because what are you going to base your economy on after the oil is gone? Those are questions that need attention if one thinks ahead, if one plans for a new economy, if one plans for the reduction in oil revenue. Well, then you're probably going to be okay if you've done that planning. But if you get caught without being prepared, then it could be serious mess. And that's why thinking intelligently, not only about climate change, but also about the consequences of attempts to deal with it, is absolutely crucial part of why policymakers now need to engage.
You just heard from Simon Dalby. Simon is a professor of geography and environmental studies at Wilfrid Laurier University in Waterloo, Ontario, where he teaches in the Balsillie School of International Affairs. He's also a senior fellow at the Center for International Governance Innovation and the author of Anthropocene Geopolitics, Globalization, Security, Sustainability. This episode is brought to you in part by the University of Ottawa Press. Join us next week as we take a much-needed look ahead at policy and management in our Anthropocene era, how COVID is exacerbating ecological disruption, and some of the key takeaways from November's UN Climate Change Conference in Glasgow.
They're explicitly talking about fossil fuels. If you go back to the big Paris Agreement 6 years ago, fossil fuels weren't actually mentioned. Now it's quite clear that policymakers are realizing we're going to have to grapple with them. Whether we're going to phase out or phase down, the big squabble about those terminologies, whether we're going to phase down or phase out coal, clearly it has to be reduced. That is now widely accepted. It's not something that we're going to be able to get through without drastically reducing the use, at least of coal. And indeed, fossil fuels in general are clearly recognized as the problem that has to be tackled fairly directly.
If you like what you hear, rate us or give us a review on your podcast platform of choice. As always, sponsorship and advertising for the Authority File podcast are handled by Choice's advertising manager, Pam Marino, and all of our episodes are produced and edited by Choice's digital media assistant, Sabrina Kofer. That's all for this week. Thanks for joining us.